Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy day after Earth Day. Still an important time to pause and reflect. Most don't realize that Earth Day was founded 50 years ago to encourage environmental protection. 50 years ago. And 50 years later, here we are in lockdown, indoors, celebrating it, which I think should give us pause and a sense of awareness of how critical the, keeping Earth's life support system intact, because it's not something that we can take for granted. So we'll get into all of that later, and even maybe link public health to climate as well, Professor. But before we go into that, I'd like to thank all of the people who joined us, and especially you, Dr. Henderson, for our conversation today. For those of you who, sorry, go.
I was just going to say, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's really an honor to have you. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Rebecca Henderson is a professor at Harvard University. She has a joint appointment at the Harvard Business School in General Management and Strategy Units. Professor Henderson is also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work explores how organizations respond to large-scale technological shifts, which obviously we're going through many of them, most recently in regards to energy and the environment. And I know a lot of you have heard me say that the transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy is a massive technological shift that is probably going to be the biggest investment opportunity in human history, but we'll get into that in the interview. And her book, Reimagining Capitalism, is coming out this coming Tuesday, which everybody on this call will get an ebook of. And with that said, let's begin. Dr. Henderson, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we can, Dr. Henderson and I were talking earlier about kind of the dizzying amount of coincidences it took for life to exist on the planet in the first place, but we're going to set that aside and not get into any of these, like dizzying statistics. But let's take a step, even though most people on this seminar are going to be pretty versed with the climate crisis. Maybe for those who are not and just have a general understanding that we do have a crisis. Not really exactly sure how we got here. They live relatively consciously. They're thoughtful about their actions. But really, how did we get here? And what is this crisis? Like, what's going on and where are we going?
So I love your idea that it's a major disruption. I spent the first 20 years of my career as the Kodak Professor of Management at MIT. And I think the world is facing a Kodak moment, a sort of massive transition from being reliant on fossil fuels to being reliant on energy produced without fossil fuels. How did we get here? We had the very bad luck that the driving force of modern industrialization, that is coal, oil, gas, the thing that made the Industrial Revolution, the thing that made us rich, it turns out that when you burn fossil fuels, they release carbon dioxide. And it turns out that when you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it makes a sort of barrier to sunlight. So sunlight comes in, bounces off the earth, bounces back out, but with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, an extra amount of sunlight gets trapped inside the Earth's atmosphere. And so it's just our bad luck that the thing that we built our civilization on is slowly and steadily heating up the planet. And now, as I'm sure many people know, we're approaching 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we used to be. And you might say, well, 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, I mean, that doesn't sound like such a big deal. I live in New England, and let me tell you, there's a lot more difference between summer and winter than 1.5 degrees. But I think the way to think about it is, if your temperature, Ibrahim, if your temperature went up by 1.5 degrees, you would not feel happy. That this apparently small increase in temperature is already causing all kinds of disruptive effects. I mean, we're seeing fires in California, fires in Australia, massive floods in Jakarta. Houston had 3 500-year floods in 3 years. So floods that were only supposed to happen once every 500 years, they got 3 of them in 3 years. So as the earth warms, we're starting to see these effects. And sometimes we call it climate change. We really should call it climate weirding. Because what the atmosphere is super complicated. I mean, it's massive fluid dynamics, how clouds behave, where does the heat go, how much heat is taken up in the oceans, super tough. But what we're doing, and this the scientists absolutely agreed on, is we're destabilizing the system. More floods, more rain, more drought. In the equatorial band of the Earth, so much heat that now in several parts of the world, including New Delhi, people can't work outside already for some days of the year. And at the north, in the Arctic and the Antarctic, it's warming even faster. And the really scary thing about this is the scientists have been telling us for a while that, excuse me, this is not a good idea, we should stop. But all their predictions, not all their predictions, in general, they have underestimated how fast things would change. So, I mean, a couple of my favorite numbers. In 2007, the IPCC, which is the central body of scientists, which comes to a consensus on this, estimated that we'd see about 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Well, now they're estimating we're going to see 6.6 feet. In 2007, they estimated it would be 100 years before we had an ice-free Arctic. Now they're saying it's going to be 2040. That's only 20 years away. That's like we've gone from, oh, it's 100 years to 20 years. So we're seeing these effects happening much faster and more aggressively than we thought. We've already had major civil wars, lots of evidence to suggest that the Syrian war and the Sudanese civil war were both prompted by massive droughts that drove people into the big cities. No single event can be ascribed to climate change, but what climate change does is it makes these kinds of events more likely. The Department of Defense is throwing around figures like 100 million climate refugees by 2050. It's pretty clear that most of South Vietnam will be underwater by 2050.
Wow.
It's probable that a very large section of Bangladesh will be underwater. We're going to see literally tens of millions of people on the move, potentially destabilizing political systems. So that's sort of climate change in 3 minutes. Is that what you were after?
Yes, I mean, it's very important that people understand, that this is beyond just, a little warmer days here and there, and how many knock-on effects and destabilizing ripples this is going to create for the world, which is going to dovetail us into economics for a minute. So when you were saying all of this, my first thought was, what's going to happen to the insurance industry and premiums on everything, and how is that going to affect every asset class?
So a bunch of assets are going to become uninsurable, including, for example, most of the beachfront real estate in Miami. Indeed, in many parts of the US, it is already uninsurable, and the federal government has stepped in. So now, in a particularly nasty quirk of fate, people who live inland, who tend to be poorer, are subsidizing the insurance premiums of the richer people who tend to be on the beachfront. So we're going to see a bunch of assets become uninsurable, and we know that's going to be a huge hindrance to economic growth. One of the most concerning aspects of the crisis is insurance companies are pretty good at estimating risks when everything's kind of ticking along pretty much as normal. What the insurance industry appears to be waking up to big time is, whoa, we don't know what the risks are. We don't know how hard it's going to hit. We don't know how much difference it's going to make. Let's talk agriculture. So one of the mainstays of our agricultural system has been crop insurance. But as climate change really starts to take a toll, we had unprecedented flooding in the Midwest, in the farm country last year. The costs of, the insurers are saying, like, wait a moment, this is not normal risk. So if you think about it, the variance is going up. That's what I mean by climate weirding. It's not that it will be bad every year. It's some years in some places. The fire risks, we saw this in California. One of my closest friends had his house burned down in Sonoma County in the California fires. And I said, so are you going to rebuild? He said, I don't think I can get fire insurance. I don't think anyone will write that for me. And that's the kind of issue we're going to start to see is the insurance industry will be either raising premiums enormously or simply refusing to insure.
Fascinating, fascinating. All right, well, for those of you who aren't familiar with FullCycle, I'd like to explain what we do and then get some advice from you, Professor, about areas that we might direct our business model into. So we basically, I've been investing personally in what I call climate critical technology since 2003. And the reason is just because I was a scuba diver and I saw the degradation in the quality of the marine life firsthand. And it felt like the oceans were kind of the canary in this climate coal mine from the visible front. In 2003, things weren't as evident and as clear as they are now. Like you said, 3 floods in Houston, 300-year floods in 3 years. So that wasn't
bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. We're losing the coral reefs. Something you're very much aware of.
Yeah, I mean, by the 10th time I dove in the same spot, it went from vibrant and lush to completely desolate and dead and full of plastic. So it was very clear that if we kept down the path that we're going on, the things that matter the most are going to be fading away in our lifetime. That was clear to me. So this is the direction that I took. And so FullCycle was built not just as a private sector lever to combat the climate crisis. And the model is as follows. So we identify these technologies that can abate a minimum of 1 gigaton or more of CO2 once fully deployed. And we get there by choosing technologies that focus primarily on short-lived climate pollutants. These molecules that make up 24% of atmospheric greenhouse gases, but are responsible for close to 50% of the warming, because we consider them kind of the lowest hanging fruit. And since CO2 is a gas that our bodies have evolved to be able to breathe, and doesn't adversely affect our health, like for example, nitrous oxide, which is really hurting children in places like Beijing and Delhi. And we focused on SLCPs. So we find these technologies and we only invest in what we call market-ready tech. So tech that's ready to break ground tomorrow, not something that still needs to go through the demonstration phase stages and the basically pre-commercialization. We want commercially ready technology because we're out of time. That's how we look at it. And we've identified waste as a big one, and different kinds of waste. We have municipal solid waste solutions, anaerobic digestion solutions, because most waste breaks down into methane, and methane is 86 times more heat trapping than CO2, or breaks down into leachate and destroys groundwater. And I don't know if you know this, and I'd be happy to send you the article. They flew a satellite over California to identify where there's fugitive methane happening, and they found 3 leaks in the natural gas pipelines, and they fixed them. But one of the shocking things was that they found that 41% of fugitive methane from the state of California came from our landfills. So, and these are considered sanitary landfills, where 70% of the world actually just uses open pits. So this is our model, and this is where we focus. And we wanted to ask you, where else should we be looking for these short-lived climate pollutants, and how do you feel about the model of identifying them first before we go after CO2?
So first, I'm not going to give you investment advice, Ibrahim. You've been doing this for many years. I sit around and teach students read books and write. So I just want to be really clear that I'm not a qualified investment advisor. There are a number of things I like about the outline of your model. So first, I think there's an enormous opportunity in ready for market projects. There's been a lot of technological development, and actually getting them into the market, that famous valley of death, moving from the technology to getting into the hands of people that can use it and solving the commercialization problems, that's absolutely critical. For example, I noticed that you have in your portfolio an additive to reduce methane emissions from cows. So I had the great pleasure of working a little bit with DSM, and they have a similar project. And that's huge, right? Cow farts are responsible for a significant share of greenhouse gas warming. It's insane. And there are ways to fix that. We have the technology to do that. But getting the farmers to take the supplement and feed it to their cows, super hard. So that's an example of the kind of commercialization opportunity, which I think, if it can be cracked, will have an enormous effect on the crisis. And you asked me if I think it makes sense to focus on the sort of other gases beyond CO2. So I think it depends, right? I know there are good investment opportunities in bringing down CO2 emissions for sure, but there's a couple of attractive things about focusing on the other gases. I mean, one of them, as you mentioned, is that the costs in human health of continuing to burn fossil fuels are absolutely enormous. The public health people say, you know, they're really hard to estimate, so big uncertainty bars, but order of magnitude at least as big as the climate damage. I mean, just to give you one sense, one estimate from a bunch of reputable public health people, and I say this because they work at Harvard, is that the health costs of burning fossil fuels in the US today are between 2.5 and 6% of GDP. That's an enormous amount of damage that's being caused. It's in millions of lives. And so going after those gases that cause damage is certainly a way to go. Now, of course, a lot of that damage is caused by particulates, not by the gases themselves. But presumably, if you're trying to reduce the gases, you may also have an effect on the particulates. So, you know, potentially huge health gains as well. What else do I like? Well, those are the two big features I really like about the model as you've described it to me, is this focus on commercialization and the focus on sort of niche opportunities with high human health benefits. But mostly, the bit I like about your investment strategy, which you haven't mentioned, is you think you can generate commercial returns with these projects, that you don't need to give up returns. And I just want to say that that's consistent with how I think about this Kodak moment. Can I come back to the Kodak moment and why I think that it's realistic that you can generate market returns? So here's the thing about Kodak moments. They're hard. You have to do things in a new way. So I work with Nokia as they resolutely refuse to respond effectively to Apple, and I actually work with Kodak as they just could not find a way to understand the transition from commercial film to digital film. They had a bunch of the technology. That wasn't the problem. Their problem was your problem. Their problem was they didn't know how to commercialize it and make money out of it. They could not make that work. And I spent the first 20 years of my career looking at firms grappling with these kinds of problems. And when I say we're in a Kodak moment and we look at climate change, here's what I mean. I mean, most people say it's not happening. That's a classic moment of transition, even though the science is so strong. The science on climate change is much stronger, for example, than the science on oncology or cancer. When your cancer surgeon gives you a recommendation for treatment, he or she is working on much less strong science than what we know about global warming. So, but people deny it. People are busy. It's not visible. It's not happening. Go away, don't bother me. The second thing they say is, it's not going to make me any money. That's just our kind of deep-seated response to anything significantly new that's going to require doing things in a new way. And then the third thing they say is, okay, maybe it's happening, maybe I can make money, but I'm kind of busy. I'm doing the thing I always knew how to do. I don't have the capabilities or the time to do the new thing. And, you know, they always say that. So in a funny kind of way, I'm optimistic about climate because we have the same problem. Well, firstly, we know it's happening. A lot of people say, well, you can't make money doing it, but we now have very good evidence that there's a bunch of projects around that yield these kinds of returns. I don't know about your projects in particular. I haven't seen your financials, but I've seen this. I mean, let me just pick one at random. Walmart committed to going to drastically reducing its carbon emissions in 2005, way before it was a fashionable thing to do. And everyone said, oh, it's just a PR stunt. You know, they have PR problems. They're going to go green and cover themselves in glory. It turns out they saved a ton of money. When they rejiggered their transportation fleet, they took $1 billion to the bottom line. $1 billion in money that was kind of sitting on the floor because no one had bothered to rejigger the transportation fleet because, hey, it's very small potatoes. For most firms, it's only about 3% of costs, so why should I pay attention to energy use? We have a ton of these kinds of examples. So I'm sure that there is money there. I do, though, want to say one other thing, which is, in my experience, going after the money requires vision and persistence and creativity. So it's not like it's easy. And my guess is you say, oh, we have this portfolio of projects. My sense is you had to look for those. So it's not that, yeah, your money's just lying around easily, although in energy conservation it probably is. But in what you're talking about, I'm sure there's money there, but I'm also sure it requires, you know, moving first, taking a risk, really understanding the way the world is changing.
Yeah, and it is changing. It is changing. And thankfully, we have people approaching us and more and more and more, as opposed to us going and looking, because people are looking for these solutions. So thank you for addressing the profit piece, because that's something that I think in this kind of post-truth world, we are so skeptical and we are having such a hard time. I run into people who cannot reconcile the idea that solving something as existential as climate change can be profitable. And the fact that it is must mean that there's some compromise there. And that is actually, if people ask me, what is the hardest thing you run into? And I would say that is the hardest thing, the cultural ability to realize that we can, without subsidies, without carbon taxes, create, risk-adjusted return that allows any investor to create the highest return on carbon and the highest adjusted risk on their capital. And that is just too much for people to absorb. It really has taken quite an effort to demonstrate that to a lot of people. Would you have anything to say about that?
So I have two things. I want to strongly agree with you and strongly disagree.
Awesome.
So let me start with a strong agreement. Absolutely, there are projects out there. I've seen companies reap 15, 16% rates of return reliably from investing in projects to lower energy use, improve conservation. Look at the recent IPO of, I forget whether it was Impossible Foods or Beyond Meat, the most successful IPO in the last 20 years or something, because they're going after a new market, fabulous new technology, great new commercialization approach. So absolutely there are returns there. I think they do take energy to find. They take people like you to go and find them, but the money is definitely there. So violent agreement, but I am going to violently disagree. I don't think we want to tell anyone that these NPV projects will take us all the way to the solution. There's going to be, the best estimates I've seen suggest about maybe 30, 40%, that if we picked up everything that's NPV positive, we would take out 30 or 40%, which, don't get me wrong, is huge. It would make so much difference. It would keep us going for years. It's fabulous, got to do it. But there's a remainder that almost certainly is going to require some kind of public subsidy. Now, let me be clear. There will be a very high rate of return on that public subsidy. The cost of not making those investments as a society will be very large. So from a social perspective, very high return, but there'll be social investments by their very nature. Let me give you an example with transportation. We need to completely decarbonize transportation. and people are investing heavily in electric vehicles. They can clearly see it coming. They clearly see they're going to make money. They're fabulous. But if we're really going to decarbonize the world's transportation systems, we're going to have investments in distributed power and charging points and changing the way buses work in cities. I mean, there's going to be a bunch of complementary investments. Similarly, probably in agriculture, we know how to, get greenhouse gas emissions out of agriculture, but that's going to require some government intervention as well. So, I mean, as you know, I'm a huge fan of private investment, but I think we have to keep in mind that we're going to need government action as well. And in fact, I think if investors are smart, they should be pushing for that government action, but that's another question.
I mean, we don't disagree. We actually believe that in, sometime in the next 5 years, there will be a global price on carbon. And our IRR shoots up by 10% or so when that happens. So we're not opposed to it at all. We just don't take on technologies unless they're commercially viable without it, because we understand and that this is not going to be solved with a couple $100 million or a couple $100 billion. And in order to get to the trillions needed, we have to have an economic track record that stands on its own without any sort of, let's say, hopeful gimmicks that are based on which government happens to be in power or not in power. So we're in agreement and not in violent opposition.
No, that makes total agreement. And let me sort of even strengthen what you said. Because I think at the same time, if you can make a decent return to your investors, you'll have much broader effects on the whole ecosystem. You'll persuade other people to look at these kinds of projects, already huge. You take some technologies down the learning curve, other people will come in because they're like, whoa, yeah, let's do that. I think you also help change the political, social, and cultural environment. That as long as we think solving climate change is unbelievably expensive and will never happen, why should we even begin? But powerful examples of ways that we can make progress make it so much easier to build the kind of cultural and political support for taking us the whole way. So no. We're ultimately in agreement. I just always nervous when people think we can solve the climate crisis all the way and make money, because that's not going to be true. I wish it would.
All right. I have 2 more questions before we open it up to some of these participants. One of them is, the nuclear energy has, speaking of cultural shifts, is still suffering from a lack of cultural acceptance. You're friends with Ray Rothrock, who invented and invested in Tri-Alpha. No. And, ironically, I'm an investor personally, not FullCycle, in Tri-Alpha. And I was wondering how you feel about modern fission and about fusion.
So I'm a huge nuclear booster. If I ran the world, or even just the US, I'd be building as many nuclear plants as I could, as fast as I could. Why? Because they provide baseload power, which, I'm sorry, that's a little bit of technical jargon. The way to think about it is wind and solar are amazing and their prices are coming down, but they only provide power when the sun shines or the wind blows. And so in order to build a generation grid, a power grid, just on the basis of wind and solar, you need to have enormous amounts of storage so that when the sun is shining, you can pump that power into a huge battery, or when the wind is blowing, you can store that. That's possible. We still haven't made the technological breakthroughs necessary to make it economic. And what's good about nuclear is it's just always on. It's always running. Now, for good reasons, people are jumpy about nuclear, but as you suggest, with recent advances in nuclear technology, we're looking at the ability to build much smaller reactors that are so-called fail-safe. So if all the power fails and the coolant fails, the reactor shuts down completely safely, and that generate much, much, much less waste, plausibly almost zero waste. So we have the technology. I think there are all kinds of social, cultural, and even political barriers to rolling it out, but I'd be very surprised if in the end we don't return to building nuclear. If it were me, as I said, I would be building a plant a week or more.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. In fact, some of these technologies that if an earthquake hit and the reactor cracked, the energy that would seep out couldn't boil a cup of tea. That's how great technologies are. All right, and my last question, and it relates to the environment that we find ourselves in. There's something that I see that is hopeful, which is we now know, and if we're going to implement a price on carbon, it's going to have to be a global price on carbon, so no one economy has an advantage over another one. And the idea is always everybody saying, well, we're not going to do it until they do it, and we're not going to implement it until they do. And now we know that faced with a common problem, we can create a global coordinated response. So we know that. There's no more saying that, hey, we can't do this because they don't do it. We can create solutions on a global scale. We're all in our homes, talking to each other on Zoom and having these kinds of conversations. So do you feel like there's lessons here for the global community to understand that we can react for the first time as a common species in a family of nations and cooperate against this? Is this a lesson we're going to take out of this pandemic that we find ourselves in, or am I being too hopeful?
Oh, Ibrahim, I love hope. We won't do anything without hope. But hope is a virtue because you have to practice it. So first, as I know you know, the global cooperation around the pandemic is full of holes. We are leaving countries that basically have no healthcare system to fend for themselves. Let me just give you one example. The Western textile companies, Western apparel companies basically stopped ordering from their supply chains in the East. So for example, that's some incredible chunk of Bangladesh's economy just vaporized. And, if you live in Bangladesh, you don't have a lot of savings. So the global cooperation could be a lot better. That said, I do think the pandemic is helpful. I think the pandemic is helpful because it reminds us the world can change in an instant. And alas, when a climate disaster hits, the world changes immediately. And so it makes it easier to say, you wished we'd had a medical stockpile that was, properly set up. Let's do the same thing for climate. Let's take out the insurance if we had known what we know now, we would have paid for that stockpile and we would have had the ability to track the disease. So I'm really hoping that experience sets people up to go, oh, right, we got to prepare because it could get really bad. I do think the experience of global cooperation is useful. I think now I'm going to be super hopeful, okay? And you can tell me I'm a little bit romantic and naive, but here goes. I think this pandemic reminds us of what's really important. And that it's not about chasing piles of stuff. And that there is something to be said for the ability just to have dinner with a friend. And I don't for a moment mean to suggest that people living on a few dollars a day or at the poverty line have life easy and don't need more economic growth. Of course they do. But many of us are pretty fortunate. And I think we've let ourselves get sort of totally focused on me, now. And I think what the pandemic does, hopefully, is open us up to the importance of us and later. And really reminding ourselves of what's important. I mean, I don't know about you, but I would give a great deal just to be able to walk into my local restaurant in Cambridge, nothing special, sit with my husband surrounded by friends and just have dinner. We took that completely for granted. And, always going for something higher or larger, but, what was really important all that time. So that's my chance to say I'm hopeful and optimistic from the pandemic.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you for doing that. And I felt that, and I am too also romantic. So hopefully other people are connected to that part of themselves too.
But you're a pragmatic romantic.
We have to be. I mean,
yeah.
And by the way, if you're listening and you have questions, please start typing them in or whichever way that we're supposed to be collecting them for Dr. Henderson. But going back to what you said, it's, we have to be pragmatic because it's we played this trick on ourselves, and I do it with my workouts, right? Like I will work out tomorrow. It's been 5 years, but I will work out tomorrow. So this is a mind trick that human beings do on themselves, where they think that, okay, well, as long as we have it in our mind, somehow that means we're addressing it. And that's just not true, because we have too condensed a time frame to address climate change. And we literally launched a whole enterprise around this, and that was the purpose, is just to be pragmatic, around the fact that this has to happen, and it has to be profitable, and it has to be at scale, and it has to have a specific nuanced business model to address it, or else it's not going to be effective. It's just going to be another exercise where it feels like we're doing something, but we actually are not doing it. And it's like life and earth are too precious to squander. We started a conversation before everybody came on, just talking about the dizzying amount of coincidences it took for life to exist on this planet in the first place. Just like, so with that said, I don't know, Katie, if there's any questions, please let us know how we do that.
I will move it over to questions. Thank you both. So if anyone has a question, if you'd like to click raise your hand, and so that I'm able to follow you.
Wow, there was a lot of questions.
It's great.
Wonderful.
So Ibrahim, I think you should choose the questions.
So,
all right.
Correct, if you'd like to go ahead.
Or is Flo going to choose the questions? Anyway. Yeah. Ethan?
If you click the prompt that says allow yourself to talk.
I'm sorry, 1 second. Hi, sorry, am I talking?
Yes.
Am I being heard? Oh, okay. Hi. Hi, guys. I wrote a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I guess I'll skip to my second question, which is how, with the current quarantine, there's been this huge abatement of air pollution. Rumor of clear blue skies in Mumbai. How does this help make plain or make more obvious the science, the argument that climate change is in fact man-made?
Oh, I fear that that's a hard link, right? That I can believe that fossil fuels create certain bad stuff, but this invisible gas that's heating the planet, I really hope you're right, that it increases the sense that climate change is man-made. One of the interesting statistics I saw that I hope is true, but haven't gone into enough detail, is that the reduction in pollution has been such that it's saved about the same amount of lives as COVID has taken. And so I think what it may help make real is that we should stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow because of their health effects. And we get this incredible bonus, which is the climate benefit as well. But I would be very helpful on the healthcare front. I hope you're right on the link to climate change, but I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joe Sandberg, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, this is Joe Sandberg.
Hi, Joe.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm co-founder of an online financial company called Aspiration, which is focused on making it easy for people to get banking accounts that don't use their money to fund fossil fuel. And earlier in my career, I spent time on Wall Street at some big firms and saw firsthand how influential the flow of funds through banks is to funding all the fossil fuel causing climate problems. My question is, what do you think needs to happen to accelerate the movement of money out of banks and to put pressures on the banks to stop funding fossil fuel?
So I think there are two big levers. One is the very big long-term money in the market. Forgive me. So I'm on the board of an NGO called Ceres, which played an instrumental role in putting together something called Climate Action 100. And Climate Action 100 is a collection of major investors. I believe it's now up to about 30% of all the assets under management, which has agreed to go collectively to particular firms and say, look, we're in the midst of a major transition. Tell me your plan for getting through this. And in particular, going to banks and saying, you know, this is not going to work if you keep funding fossil fuels. And the reason those investors are doing that is they've come to believe that for them, for very large investors that are forced to hold the entire market, that are holding much of their funds in passive investment, they cannot diversify away from the risk of climate change. So for example, Hiro Mizuno, who until recently was the chief investment officer of the Japanese government pension fund, which is the largest pension fund in the world, he told all his asset managers to push every firm in their portfolio to start to reduce carbon and to have a plan for reducing carbon. And I think it's not coincidence that Larry Fink at BlackRock, his largest client is the Japanese government pension fund. So if you see what Larry is saying when he's saying, no, I'm really serious about this. You have to have a plan for dealing with carbon, or I may vote against your board or take other measures, that's coming from the sense that this is a real financial risk to these very large investors. I think the other lever is the obvious one, which is we need some form of carbon regulation or carbon price. And by carbon, I mean some form of greenhouse gas regulation or price. Because, you know, I'm an economist. I have a PhD in economics from Harvard. I love the free market. If we said, no, when you emit a ton of carbon dioxide, that's expensive because it's emitting real costs on the society, both now and later, you have to pay for it, we would start to shift immediately. And banks are really good at those kinds of calculations, right? If we had some kind of price or regulation on greenhouse gas emissions, you can tell that the oil and gas industries are not going to be in business in the long term. You start pulling money out of those investments. So I think some combination of pressure from investors plus government regulation would make an enormous difference to the banks.
Thank you.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes.
Other thing that's going to make a big difference, it was Joe, right?
Yes.
Joe is people like you. Nothing forces incumbents to change faster than entrepreneurial startups showing there's a new market. If you can show them that most retail investors care about this and will move their assets, that will really move them. Forgive me. That's the third big lever, and it's really important.
Yeah, which reminds me everybody on this call to obviously move your assets. If you care about this, move your assets.
Yeah.
Right. Next person.
Hello? James Newman, would you like to ask a question?
Hello?
Hi, we hear you.
Oh, hello. Yes, I'm with JP Newman. I'm Rob Hanna, and I have a question for both of you, which, Rebecca, you just raised, which is the retail consumer and market behavior. The brilliance of innovation and technology to outperform the status quo is always the promise. And we've seen so many wonderful ideas suffer language because of lack of uptake by end consumers. And as much as I see the importance of governmental policies changing and also institutional capital flow supporting innovation, how are we going to tackle what comes down to sort of a fundamental shift of individuals in their households behaving differently and unlocking that power? Because COVID-19, if anything, is instrumental in showing us how they can shut down an entire industry, oil industry that we've been so utterly dependent upon almost within a few weeks. And if there was a way for us to harvest that behavioral change shift towards these technologies, maybe somewhere along the lines of perhaps Rory Sutherland's book, Alchemy, Behavioral Change Economics. I don't know if you're familiar with Rory, but that seems to be the real missing piece. I think there's no lack of brilliance or good ideas in institutional corners and in innovation.
Ibrahim, you want to take that?
No, because I was reading these questions and lining up the last one.
Okay, I'll take it. Individual behavior change. Is it central? Can it work? What will drive it? So first, we know from the research that so far most consumers are unwilling to pay more for green products and services. There are some well-known exceptions like Tesla, but in the main, consumers will not pay more. What they will do is switch. So if you offer consumers a product that meets their needs for a similar price and it's green, they are likely to switch. So Unilever, for example, claims that the brands that are purpose-driven and are really pushing this are growing twice as fast as the rest of their portfolio. And they're trying to switch the whole portfolio as fast as they can. So there is some behavioral change in shopping, which sounds like a little thing, except makes a big difference, right? If firms believe that if they pay attention to this, they can gain market share in today's competitive environment, that will drive a lot of change. But I think your question is going more deeply than that to, have I cut back on my flying, for example, which for people like us is often the single biggest difference we can make. Should I cut back on my flying? Should I stop eating beef? Should I live in a smaller house? Should I take public transportation? We know that in the end, I think fairly clearly, we won't solve the problem until and unless we start to see these kind of behavioral changes. But they're tough, they're super tough. Now, I like the research that suggests there's a critical mass, that as more and more people start to enact these behaviors, they start to affect the people around them. So for example, there's some nice research suggesting that those people who say, I am no longer flying because of its effect on the climate, that in their friend group, the amount of flying drops significantly. What we know about humans is we're herd animals, right? My vision of how eventually we're going to solve this is at some moment we're going to look at each other and say, we would never employ children in our factories. Why are we burning fossil fuels? There's one of my favorite cartoons, New Yorker cartoons, is a group of children sitting around a fire in rags. And in the background, you can see the city and it's clear that civilization has been destroyed. And one of the children is saying to the others, we did destroy the planet, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of shareholder value. At some moment, we're going to go, this is crazy, let's stop. And the thing is, we have the technology. It's not like we have to go back to living in mud huts. We really don't. We have the technology and the resources to make this transition with minimal changes in lifestyle, although there will be some. I think we'll be eating engineered protein rather than actual dead cow, for example. But all I can say is I think of all of us as trying to help drive this moment. I mean, the image that's in my head is we need an avalanche. We need everyone to move. And you never know what causes the avalanche. Like, is it pebble A or pebble B or pebble D? We don't know, but let's get rolling is how I think about it. And that's why I think individuals can make an enormous difference because of these dynamics of social contagion and social change.
Great response. I'm glad you took it longer. Katie, one last question.
We have one last question, and could we get maybe the two of you to lower your volume a little bit? We're getting some echo feedback, and then whenever anyone's asking a question, they could also lower their volume. Hopefully that will help. Let's see. John, did you have a question?
Yes, I'm already a believer and a current investor in FullCycle, but I'm looking at the poorly timed oil price wars in a time when there's zero demand for oil and futures have now gone negative. So all the conversation globally is about the current crises, but how can climate stakeholders kind of use this current environment and with lack of oil demand and the price war, how can you pivot and use that to help the climate change initiatives?
So I think you're asking a very deep question, John, because we've been talking as if there wasn't a pandemic raging and as if this wasn't going to take most of the air out of the conversation and most of the attention for the foreseeable future, at least in terms of months and maybe a couple of years. So two things. First, I will send to Ibrahim and ask him to send to everyone on the call a really nice piece of research on how to talk about climate change when the pandemic's going on. It comes out from one of the NGOs who's been doing a lot of psychological research on the, how to talk to people so they can actually hear what you're saying. And for example, one of the things it says is you have to be super careful to acknowledge the suffering and distress that's going on now. And that if climate people come off as saying, say, we told you so, now we should do climate, that's potentially very dangerous. And so it lays out a number of strategies for talking about this. So I will send Ibrahim that piece, and I hope you find it useful if you get a chance to look at it. I think, though, that we chatted a little bit about how this emergency might help. I'll give you my favorite reason as to why it might help. I think we're seeing, in a way that many people haven't seen, how important it is to have a government that has at least a working capacity to address these kinds of public problems. So one of the things that makes me super nervous about the current moment is watching the states compete against each other for valuable medical equipment. That makes me crazy. I think competition is fantastic, but there are times when competition is not good. There are times when you want the federal government to step up and say, we have a problem and we can help solve this problem, and we will use the free market, absolutely. We will place orders in the free market, but we'll place them from the federal government and we will allocate them, and we won't allow, forgive the term, price gouging. Because I think what's going on now is bringing capitalism into disrepute. And it's a problem that more than 50% of millennials, and particularly the young kids, think that capitalism is not okay. That's a huge problem. We're never going to solve the problems we face without capitalism. But I think what this crisis is doing is showing that, having a functioning CDC and people who could have rolled out testing earlier and people who were sort of more on the ball can make a real difference. So I hope that coming out of this pandemic, we'll have a real conversation about the importance of having a government in partnership with business, rather than thinking, as I think some of us hoped perhaps, that business could basically handle everything. I think it's quite clear at moments like this that can't be done. And that could be very helpful in laying in place some of these regulations and rules that would really help us solve the climate problem.
Great response.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to open up just one last question. It's a kind of a roll up of a bunch of questions that we've seen in the chat. Song Peck, if you'd like to ask a question.
You're on mute, Song.
Okay, I think that worked.
Yes.
Hi, thank you, Katie. Hi, I'm Song Pak. I'm General Counsel at Revolution. We're a tech investment firm based in Washington, D.C., founded by AOL co-founder Steve Case. And we invest in seed, venture, and growth stages in all sorts of technology-enabled platforms. Thank you very much, Abraham and Rebecca. This has been a very fascinating conversation, and I look forward to reading the book. I have a question for Rebecca. So we are quite literally, in the midst of reimagining capitalism in this moment of pandemic. And in the United States, entire industries could either fail or be taken over by government in the months and possibly years to come. In the research that you've done, do moments of crisis like this tend to help continue positive momentum in areas like sustainability, or possibly stall it? One question that's been on my mind this week that actually I believe James kind of in the prior question touched on is the issue of the oil war and the oversupply pushing prices down in a way that will put many, if not all, U.S. shale producers out of business. In that instance, we've been making positive steps towards sustainable energy, but will we potentially have the U.S. come in and intervene in a way to help protect this industry from being totally almost annihilated, quite honestly, in the interest of geopolitics and not having to be energy dependent on other countries. Which way does the momentum go in times like this?
You asked whether moments of crisis like this tend towards positive effects on sustainability. The answer is it depends. I personally believe things could get a lot worse or a lot better. And that one of the reasons conversations like this are so important is it really matters what we do. My reading of history is there have been moments when the private sector has stepped up at moments like this of crisis and said, we cannot continue playing by the same rules. They will just get us more of the same, and that's not good for us and it's not good for you. So there have been moments when the private sector has stepped up and played an incredibly positive role. It has had to believe it had no choice, that business as usual was really a dead end. And I think part of the task that confronts us is trying to persuade many of our colleagues that indeed there is no choice, that continuing to go the same way will end badly. The second part of your question about the price of oil and the very strong political pressure an administration will face to bail out the industry and restart it, I think here it really matters. I think the election really matters. I don't think there's anything inherently anti-environmental in being a Republican. I've known many Republicans who are all in favor of climate action and clean water and clean air. But I think with this particular administration, if it continues in power, the scenario you laid out is much more likely than if we change administrations. I know you know that, but I do think this election is incredibly important precisely because of this dynamic. And of course, any administration will have to deal with people who are suffering and at risk because their employment has collapsed. But there are different ways to deal with that. There are much more and less productive ways to deal with the collapse of an industry, which has just been at least partially responsible for enormous environmental damage.
Great answer. Okay, well, we're getting to the end of our time here, and I know you're booked back-to-back, Professor, so I'm gonna let you think about this for a second. If you had 150 investors on a call, what would you say to him as your last words? But before you say that, what I would like to remind everybody is that if you're on this call, you're gonna get an ebook version of Dr. Henderson's Reimagining Capitalism and the World on Fire. And I'd also like to see her book make a strong showing on the New York Times bestseller list. So please order one for a friend, for your organization, for your family. And if you're like me and still enjoy holding a book in your hand while you read it, order another one for yourself as well. Thank you all for joining us, and to you, Doctor, for the response to my last question.
Ibrahim, thank you for the plug. That was fantastic. Let me answer your question. If I were an investor right now, I would do two things. I would continue to invest or invest for the first time in projects that are likely to reduce the effects of climate change. I have spent all of my life studying change. This really feels like another of those moments. Sooner or later, we are going to make this shift. And I believe very strongly that those who invest in it will do well. Of course, you need diversified portfolios, all the rules apply, but I think there's a major opportunity here. And the second thing I would say is I think investors together have enormous strength and power. So if you're a very large investor, even if you're smaller, think about the other firms in your portfolio. Think about yourself as a political actor. We need to move the whole society, and investors have a very privileged and powerful position. And if you invest in reducing carbon, pushing the rest of society in that direction is in your best interest. So aligned incentives, that's what I'm all about. But seriously, when people say to me, are we going to solve the climate crisis? And they say, why am I optimistic? I say two reasons. One, because my students are incandescent they really don't want us to burn the planet. And these are Harvard MBAs. They are so on this wavelength. And secondly, because investors are beginning to understand just how important it is to make this transition for the value of their own portfolios. Thank you very much.
And of course,
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
thank you for saying yes. And we've learned a lot today. Thank you for your time, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll reach out with the ebook and with our next Futures with FullCycle.